Welcome back to the Schoen Design Studio. I'm Ian Schoen, and today we're going to talk about the Pocket 6 fountain pen. We're going to do a little fountain pen 101. So we're going to talk about how to write with a fountain pen. We're going to talk about how to install an ink cartridge, how to clean the pen, and how to troubleshoot if the pen's not starting immediately. So we've got our Pocket 6. What we're going to do is we're going to uncap the pen by unscrewing the cap, and then we're going to screw post it on the back of the body. Now we're going to take this piece. This brass piece is called the grip section. On your pen, it may match the pen or it may be a different material altogether. And you're going to unscrew that from the body. So as you can see, there's no ink cartridge attached to your Pocket 6. Well, in the box, there's going to be an ink cartridge. So what we're going to do is we're going to install this cartridge and we're going to get the pen writing. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to line up the little plastic nub on the back of the nib unit. And the nib, mind you, is this steel piece here. And the nib unit is the feed, the nib, and a plastic housing. So we're going to line up that nub with the front of this cartridge. And we're going to plug it in like so. All right, we're going to reinstall this section now with the ink cartridge installed into the nib, back into the pen. What I like to do is I like to leave the pen nib facing downward like this. Like sometimes I'll put the cap on and I'll leave it on my desk kind of like this, propped up against something so that the ink can start to flow through the feed. The feed is the black plastic part on the back of the nib, and it regulates the ink flow through the pen. So while we're waiting for the ink to flow into the feed, which with a brand new fountain pen can take a moment, we're going to talk about how to write with a fountain pen. So when you're writing with a nib, what you want to keep in mind is the nib should rest on the paper like this. Not like this, because that's just metal that's going to hit the side of the paper. Not like this, again, just metal on the paper. We want the nib and the slit in the center of the nib to kind of line up with the paper like so that when we're writing, the ink can fall out from that slit and be drawn onto the paper through capillary action. Essentially, the way fountain pens work is they're a controlled leak system, and as ink flows through the nib and the feed, air is being allowed to go into the cartridge, and that's what allows the system to kind of work. So the feed's only function is to slow down ink from pouring out the front of the cartridge and to direct the flow through the slit and out the front of the pen. So like we said, it may take a moment for this nib to get started. Like I'm gonna go to write with this and nothing's happening. I don't need to push hard on the fountain pen to make it work, unlike a stubborn marker or an old pen. The way we're gonna get this ink to flow is we're gonna take a little bit of water, we're going to put it on our finger, and we're going to wipe the front of the nib like so. And we're going to wipe from the breather hole on the top of the nib to the tip of the fountain pen nib. And this has a green cartridge in it. So what I'm looking for is I'm going to start to see a little green ink on the front of my finger, and that means that we've got a little bit of ink flowing out the front of the pen. If this bothers you and you don't want to get green ink on your finger, that's totally fine. Use a piece of plastic or a plastic bag or a glove. I wouldn't use a paper towel, because what a paper towel will do is, though you'll start to see that green ink showing up on the paper towel, it's sucking the ink out from the breather hole in the nib through the paper, and it's not directing it out the front of the nib. So we want to direct that flow all the way to the front of the nib. And that's what's gonna, that's what's gonna establish a nice flow path for the ink and get things started. You don't need to do this every time you start a fountain pen. However, I've found that straight from the factory, this tends to happen a little bit. What you'll notice on the first couple strokes with this fountain pen that you've just inked up is that the ink color may look very light. And as you continue to write, the ink color is going to get darker and darker. As you can see, this is the first stroke here, and as I continue to write, it's getting darker and darker with this green colored ink cartridge. That's because the water is diluting the ink. So as I continue to write, It's getting darker and darker. Also keep in mind that with a brand new freshly inked fountain pen, the feed may not be able to keep up with the flow of ink. It's still establishing its flow paths. Those fins on the back are still filling with ink. So we need to be patient in the first couple hours of using a brand new fountain pen to make sure that everything is saturated and flowing freely. So now I'm getting this beautiful color. This is a green ink cartridge from Monteverde. It's absolutely wonderful. We're happy. Keep in mind, we don't need to put a ton of pressure when writing with the fountain pen. It should just glide across the paper and make a beautiful line. Pushing on the fountain pen can bend the nib. That can be a problem. If you're still not getting any ink flow, check to make sure that the feed and the nib are aligned with each other. And you can nudge these parts with your finger gently. It's totally fine to nudge the feed or push the nib a little bit to get things to line up. Sometimes in shippings, things can receive a shock and maybe they get misaligned and that can cause an issue. It's not normally an issue, but it's another thing to check. All right, so we're writing. How do I care for my fountain pen on a daily basis? Well, the first thing about fountain pens that are different from ballpoint pens is that if you leave the fountain pen out on the table for 5 minutes, that ink is gonna dry up inside of the nib and it's gonna start skipping, or it'll do a hard start, meaning you'll go to write, nothing will happen, and then it'll just start all of a sudden. That's because the ink is drying up in the slit and is causing a flow issue. So what you wanna do in that situation is if you've left your fountain pen out overnight, or you forgot to cap it and you went to a meeting and you came back to your desk and it's dry and it's not writing anymore, grab a little bit of water and a paper towel and just give it a little dip into the water. That'll start to get things going. Again, the ink may be a little diluted as you start to write with it, but as you continue to write, it'll get darker and you'll be off to the races. Changing an ink cartridge. To change an ink cartridge, you just remove it off the back of the pen. I like to give it a little twist as I pull it off just to have control. You can just plop it off though, it doesn't really matter. And then you install a new one. If mixing this cartridge, which is a light green color, and maybe this beautiful blue ink cartridge that you bought at the store bothers you, what you can do is you can take the nib and you can dip it in some water and you can put it in a paper towel and you can clean the nib. I'll show you how to do that now. You don't necessarily need to dip the entire section, the entire grip section in the water. What you'll do is you're gonna take the water, and you're gonna dip your pen in the water. You'll start to see the water change colors. The feed is really what we want to saturate with water here because the feed is where the ink is. And then we can blot this with a paper towel and we can give it a little shake. And we can quite literally rinse and repeat until we've got a lot of that ink out of there. There are ways to take apart these nibs, but I'm going to save that for another video. That's because it's a little bit more advanced. Okay, so now we've cleaned the nib and we want to install our new ink cartridge. Again, you just plug it in the back of the pen. Fantastic. Let's talk about cleaning the pen. Let's say you leave this in your backpack and you go for a mountain bike ride and some of the ink gets shaken out of the front of the pen. That's normal, it's okay. You may see a couple ink droplets in the cap. If that bothers you, go ahead and take a Q-tip and a little water and clean up those ink blots inside the pen. And you can get that ink out of there and you'll be ready to write again. What I would not recommend is taking a big piece of paper towel and filling the cap with the paper towel, because inside of the pen cap there's actually a rubber O-ring seal, and that seal can get removed if you shove a ton of paper towel inside of the cap, and that can be a problem because it's extremely difficult to put that seal back in. I'm happy to do it for you, but please just use a Q-tip instead. So there you have it. That's your 101 on fountain pens in the Pocket 6. I hope you enjoy your new pen, and thanks for joining me in the studio today. Have a great afternoon.